50 million years ago, on the warm, shallow shores of what is now Pakistan and India, an animal was making a decision that would change the ocean forever. It did not know it was doing this. It was simply hunting, or perhaps cooling off in the water, or following prey that had slipped beneath the surface. But over the generations, over millions of years of small incremental changes, the descendants of that animal would abandon the land entirely and become the largest creatures the ocean has ever contained. This is the story of how whales went back to the sea. The return of a land mammal to the ocean is one of the most dramatic evolutionary reversals in the history of life. It has happened more than once. Sea lions and seals made the transition. Sea otters made a partial version of it. Manatees made it independently. But the whale journey is the most complete and the most extraordinary. Whales did not simply learn to swim. They transformed every aspect of their biology so thoroughly that if you showed a modern blue whale to someone who had never seen one, they might not immediately recognize it as a mammal at all. It breathes air, gives birth, is warm-blooded, and nurses its calves with milk. Every one of those traits is a mammal trait, carried over from ancestors that walked on land. What drove this transformation is a question that biologists have explored for decades, and the fossil record from Pakistan and India has provided a remarkable series of answers. The fossils discovered in that region over the past 40 years have given us a step-by-step account of the whale transition from land to sea, with transitional species filling in the gaps at intervals of a few million years each. It is one of the best documented major evolutionary transitions in the history of paleontology. To understand how whales got into the ocean, you first have to understand what they came from. The ancestors of whales were not fish-like creatures hovering at the water's edge. They were fully terrestrial, four-legged, hoofed mammals, related to the group that includes modern deer, pigs, and hippos. The closest living relative of whales, based on genetic evidence, is the hippopotamus. The hippo spends a great deal of time in water, which may hint at a shared ancestral tendency toward aquatic environments, but it is still a very long way from a hippo wallowing in an African river to a sperm whale diving 7,000 feet into the ocean. The journey between those two animals took about 15 million years. The whale is also a reminder that the ocean rewards commitment in a very particular sense. The animals that have thrived in the ocean across its long history have been those that adapted every system of their biology to its demands. The whale committed more completely than almost anything before it, and the ocean rewarded that commitment with a level of evolutionary success that is difficult to overstate. Understanding that journey also means understanding something about how the modern ocean works. Whales are not simply passengers in the ocean ecosystem. They are active participants whose feeding, migrating, and dying all contribute to the nutrient cycles that support marine productivity. In this episode, we will follow that journey step by step, from the first tentative wading of a small hoofed animal into a warm coastal sea to the evolution of the largest animals that have ever lived on Earth. Each step in the transition is documented in the fossil record, and the picture they create together is one of the most complete accounts of a major evolutionary change that paleontology has ever assembled. Understanding it means understanding something important, not just about whales, but about the remarkable flexibility of life itself when conditions make a new way of living available. The journey from land to sea took approximately 15 million years and involved changes to nearly every system of the whale body. That is a remarkably short time by geological standards, and it speaks to how powerful the selective pressure of a rich aquatic food supply can be when an animal has even a modest initial advantage in exploiting it. Every step of that journey is preserved in stone, waiting to be read by anyone patient enough to learn the language of fossils. The story of whale evolution begins with an animal called Pakicetus, whose fossils were first discovered in Pakistan in the 1980s. Pakicetus lived around 50 million years ago during a period called the Eocene, when the climate was significantly warmer than today, and the region that is now Pakistan and northwestern India was a warm, shallow coastline bordering an ancient body of water called the Tethys Sea. We discussed the Tethys Sea at length in episode 3, and it is fitting that it appears here again, because the shallow margins of the dying Tethys were the nursery in which the whale lineage was born. Pakicetus looked nothing like a whale. It was roughly the size of a large dog, walked on 4 legs, had hooves, and lived primarily on land. It had a long, narrow skull with teeth clearly designed for catching fish, and its ear bones, which are preserved in fossils and are highly distinctive in whale relatives, showed the characteristic structure that links it firmly to the whale lineage. But it was not a marine animal. It was a terrestrial animal that waded into water to hunt, probably spending time both on shore and in shallow coastal streams and estuaries, pursuing fish in the manner of a modern wading bird or a fishing mammal like an otter. The ear-bone connection is worth pausing on, because it is one of the key pieces of evidence that links the early whale ancestors to modern whales. Cetaceans, the group that includes all whales, dolphins, and porpoises, have a highly distinctive structure in the bones of the middle ear that is unlike any other mammal. This structure, called the involucrum, is so characteristic that when paleontologists find it in a fossil, they know immediately they are looking at a cetacean relative, regardless of how different the rest of the animal looks from any modern whale. Finding this structure in Pakicetus, an animal that looked like a 4-legged land mammal, was one of the pivotal discoveries in 20th century paleontology. About 5 million years after Pakicetus, a more aquatically adapted animal appeared. Ambulocetus, which means walking whale, was larger than Pakicetus, had shorter legs, and shows clear evidence of being a much more capable swimmer. Its limbs were still functional for movement on land, but the proportions and muscle attachment points on the bones suggest it moved in water much the way a modern crocodile does, propelling itself with undulations of its spine and a powerful tail while using its limbs more for steering than for propulsion. Ambulocetus probably spent more time in water than on land, hunting fish and perhaps other mammals that came to the water's edge to drink. The picture that emerges from these early fossil whales is of a lineage gradually committing more and more to the environment over millions of years, each generation slightly better suited to water than the one before it. This was not a sudden leap. It was a slow, cumulative process in which the advantages of aquatic life, access to food, the buoyancy that reduces the need to support body weight, the ability to move in 3 dimensions, gradually outweighed the costs of losing terrestrial mobility. Each step was driven by the same basic logic that has driven every major evolutionary transition. An opportunity existed, variation existed, and the individuals best suited to exploit the opportunity left more descendants than those that were not. What the fossil sequence from Pakistan and India gives us is something that paleontologists rarely have: a nearly complete record of a major evolutionary transition, played out over a relatively short geological time span in a region where the rocks preserved the evidence well enough to find and interpret. Most major evolutionary transitions are documented by fragments, isolated specimens separated by long gaps in the record. The whale transition is different. The gaps are small, the specimens are numerous, and the picture they paint is unusually clear. It is one of the most compelling stories in the entire history of paleontology. By around 45 million years ago, roughly 5 million years after Pakicetus, the whale lineage had produced animals that were increasingly committed to the water. Pakicetus, discovered in Pakistan in the 1990s, is one of the most important of these transitional species. It had a body noticeably more streamlined than Pakicetus, with shorter forelimbs and hind limbs that were clearly reduced in size and usefulness on land. Its spine shows adaptations for the up and down undulation that characterizes modern whale swimming, and crucially, its nostrils had begun to migrate. In Pakicetus, the nostrils were at the tip of the snout, as they are in land mammals. In Pakicetus, they had shifted partway back along the skull, beginning the long journey toward the top of the head, where they would eventually become the blowhole of a modern whale. The migration of the nostrils toward the top of the skull is one of the most elegant examples of functional anatomy in evolutionary history. For an animal that spends much of its time underwater but needs to breathe air, having the nostrils at the front of the face is a significant inconvenience. Every breath requires lifting the entire head out of the water. Moving the nostrils progressively further back along the skull and eventually to the top of the head means the animal can breathe with minimal interruption to its swimming, barely breaking the surface. The blowhole of a modern whale is the end point of this migration, a nostril that has travelled from the tip of the snout to the very top of the skull over the course of about 15 million years. Alongside the migration of the nostrils, the whale lineage was undergoing changes in virtually every other system of the body. The hind limbs were shrinking. In Pakicetus, they were still present, but already reduced. In later transitional species, they had become small and largely non-functional. In modern whales, they are vestigial structures, small remnant bones buried inside the body with no external expression, serving no purpose but retaining, as vestigial structures always do, the memory of a very different body plan that existed in the distant past. The tail was changing too. In the early transitional species, the tail was a simple mammalian tail, useful perhaps for balance or signaling, but not for propulsion. As the lineage became more aquatic, the tail began to broaden at the tip, developing the horizontal flukes that are the defining propulsive structure of modern whales and dolphins. Unlike the vertical tail fin of a fish, which moves side to side, the horizontal flukes of a whale move up and down, driven by the same spinal undulation that was already visible in Pakicetus. This difference in tail orientation reflects the fundamental difference in ancestry. Whales evolved their swimming motion from the galloping run of a four-legged land mammal. Fish evolved theirs from a lateral body flexion. same result, completely different origin. By around 40 million years ago, the whale lineage had produced animals that were essentially fully aquatic. Basilosaurus, which despite its name was not a reptile but a fully marine whale, could reach lengths of over 50 feet and had a long body, tiny vestigial hind limbs that were far too small to support its weight on land, and a fully developed tail fluke. It lived in warm, shallow seas across what is now North Africa, the Middle East, and the southeastern United States. It could not have survived on land. The transition from Pakicetus to Basilosaurus had taken roughly 10 million years. The story of the whale transition is also a story about how the ocean itself was changing during the Eocene, as the closing tethys reshaped the shallow coastal environments in which the early whale lineage was evolving and pushed its descendants progressively toward more open ocean habitats. The whale lineage was not simply adapting to a fixed environment. It was co-evolving with a changing ocean, and the changing ocean was in turn reshaping the selection pressures that drove each successive generation further from the shore and deeper into the sea. Basilosaurus represents a major milestone in whale evolution, but it was not the ancestor of the whales we know today. It was, in evolutionary terms, something of a side branch, a lineage that achieved full marine life through a particular body plan that did not persist. The ancestors of modern whales took a somewhat different evolutionary path, one that would eventually produce two of the most successful and distinct groups of marine mammals on Earth, each taking a fundamentally different approach to life in the ocean. The first group kept and refined the teeth their land ancestors had, using them to catch individual prey items with precision. These are the toothed whales, which include dolphins, porpoises, sperm whales, and orcas. The second group replaced their teeth entirely with plates of baleen, a fibrous material made of keratin that hangs from the upper jaw in long rows and acts as a filter, allowing the whale to take enormous gulps of water and strain out the small fish, krill, or other prey contained within it. These are the baleen whales, which include the blue whale, the humpback, and the right whale. The division between these two lineages is one of the most significant in the history of marine mammals, because it represents two completely different solutions to the same fundamental challenge of finding enough food in the ocean. The evolution of baleen was one of the great innovations in the history of ocean feeding. It allowed baleen whales to access the most abundant food source in the ocean, the vast swarms of krill and small fish that populate the upper water column at a scale that no toothed predator could match. A blue whale can consume up to 4 tons of krill in a single day during feeding season. The efficiency of baleen feeding is what allows baleen whales to grow to the extraordinary sizes they achieve. The blue whale, the largest animal ever to have lived on Earth at up to 100 feet in length and 200 tons in weight, owes its size directly to the productivity of baleen feeding in krill-rich polar waters. Toothed whales took a different but equally successful path. Rather than growing enormous and filter feeding, they became faster, more agile, and in many cases, significantly more intelligent. The evolution of echolocation in toothed whales, the ability to produce high-frequency sound pulses and interpret the returning echoes to build a detailed picture of the environment, was a transformative adaptation that gave toothed whales a sensory capability with no real equivalent elsewhere in the animal kingdom, except bats, which evolved the same ability independently. echolocation allows toothed whales to hunt in complete darkness, to detect prey hidden in murky water, and to communicate with extraordinary sophistication. The orca deserves particular mention as an example of what the toothed whale body plan is capable of at its most sophisticated. Orcas are the largest members of the dolphin family and the apex predators of the modern ocean across virtually every marine environment on Earth. They hunt in coordinated social groups, share hunting techniques across generations in a form of cultural transmission that is rare in the animal kingdom, maintain complex social bonds over lifespans of up to 90 years, and have been documented hunting prey as large as blue whales. An animal whose ancestors were hoofed mammals 50 million years ago has become the most widely distributed and ecologically flexible predator the ocean has ever seen. The diversity of the modern whale family is a measure of how comprehensively the whale body plan has been adapted to different ocean environments over the past 35 million years. From the river dolphins of the Amazon and the Ganges, which have readapted to freshwater environments, to the narwhal of the Arctic with its extraordinary elongated tusk, to the bowhead whale that can live for over 200 years in polar seas, the range of ecological niches occupied by cetaceans reflects the same restless biological experimentation that has characterized the ocean since the Cambrian. The ocean continues to reward adaptation, and the whale family has taken that reward across an extraordinary range of environments and body forms. One of the most remarkable aspects of whale evolution is what it reveals about the whale body itself, specifically the way it has retained, beneath its streamlined exterior, the anatomical signature of its terrestrial origin. A whale does not look like a mammal from the outside. It looks like a very large fish. But dissect a whale flipper and you will find inside it the same 5-digit bone structure that is present in every land mammal forelimb, including the human arm and hand. The bones are there. The humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges, all present and arranged in the same basic pattern as in any four-legged land animal. They have been modified by evolution, shortened and broadened and embedded in a flipper-shaped mass of tissue, but the underlying structure is unmistakably the hand of a land mammal. The vestigial hind limb bones are even more striking. Modern whales have no external hind limbs. From the outside, there is no visible trace that their ancestors ever had back legs at all. But inside the body, buried in the musculature near the tail, small bones can be found that are the remnants of the pelvis and, in some species, small rod-like structures that are the remnants of the femur and even the tibia. These bones serve no structural or mechanical function in the modern whale. They are evolutionary leftovers, structures that have not yet been entirely eliminated because they cause no harm. In male whales, the vestigial pelvis bones serve as anchor points for reproductive muscles, which is the main reason they have been retained. Both sexes carry the skeletal memory of the time 50 million years ago when their ancestors stood on 4 legs on a warm Eocene shore. The whale respiratory system also tells the story of its land origin. Like all mammals, whales breathe air. They cannot extract oxygen from water through gills the way fish do. The blowhole is not a gill. It is a nose. When a whale dives, it is holding its breath as any air-breathing animal must. The diving abilities of modern whales are extraordinary by the standards of air-breathing animals. Sperm whales routinely dive to depths of over 3,000 feet and can remain submerged for over an hour. They achieve this through a suite of physiological adaptations, including a very high concentration of myoglobin, the oxygen-storing protein in muscles, which gives whale meat its characteristically dark color, and the ability to slow their heart rate dramatically during a dive to conserve oxygen. The whale brain is also worth noting as evidence of its mammalian heritage. Whales and dolphins have among the largest and most complex brains of any animals on Earth, with the sperm whale possessing the largest brain in absolute size of any animal that has ever lived. The complexity of cetacean brains reflects the complexity of their social lives, their communication systems, and in the case of toothed whales, the demands of echolocation and cooperative hunting. This cognitive complexity did not develop in the ocean from scratch. It was built on the foundation of the mammalian brain that the whale ancestors brought with them from the land, expanded and elaborated by millions of years of selection in a demanding and socially complex marine environment. The whale body is also a demonstration of how completely evolution can transform an animal while still leaving the evidence of its history intact. There is no engineering principle that requires a whale flipper to contain 5 digits. A simpler structure would work just as well hydrodynamically. The reason the 5-digit structure is there is because it was in the ancestor, and changing it completely would have required a level of developmental reorganization that was never strongly enough selected for to occur. Evolution works with what it has, modifying existing structures rather than starting from scratch, and the whale carries the record of that incremental modification in its own bones. You do not have to dig through rock to find the fossil record of the whale transition. It is written in the whale itself. The evolution of whale communication is one of the most fascinating chapters in the broader story of whale biology, because it reveals an animal that has not merely adapted to the ocean physically, but has built a genuinely sophisticated cultural and social life within it. Whales are not simply large fish-shaped mammals swimming in circles. They are complex social animals with long memories, stable relationships, cultural traditions that are passed from one generation to the next, and communication systems whose full complexity we are only beginning to understand. Humpback whale song is the most well-known example of whale communication, and it is genuinely extraordinary. Male humpbacks in a given ocean basin all sing versions of the same song, a complex sequence of themes and phrases that can last for hours. That song changes over time, with new phrases appearing and spreading through the population in a process that looks remarkably like the transmission of a cultural trend. When researchers tracked humpback songs across the Pacific over a period of years, they found that new song elements originating in Australian waters spread eastward across the Pacific over 2 or 3 years, adopted progressively by whale populations further from the origin. This is not instinct, it is cultural transmission, and it is a capacity previously thought to be limited to humans and a small number of other highly social animals. Sperm whales communicate through a system of clicks called codas, short rhythmic patterns that appear to function as identity markers, allowing individual whales and social groups to recognize each other. Different groups of sperm whales have different coda repertoires, functioning somewhat like dialects. Calves learn the codas of their social group and maintain them throughout their lives. When researchers mapped the coda patterns of sperm whale groups across the Atlantic and Pacific, They found stable, geographically distinct communities with consistent cultural identities maintained across generations. The concept of a whale culture, a set of behaviors and communication patterns shared by a group and transmitted through learning rather than genetics, has moved from a fringe idea to mainstream cetacean biology over the past 2 decades. Dolphin communication research has added further depth to the picture. Bottlenose dolphins develop individual signature whistles, unique acoustic patterns that function as names, allowing individual animals to identify themselves and recognize others. Dolphins use their signature whistles to maintain contact with social partners over distance, to reconnect after separation, and in interactions with other groups. Captive dolphins have been observed using the signature whistle of an absent companion when that companion is referenced in an experimental context, behavior that researchers have interpreted as a form of referential communication, using a sound to refer to a specific individual that is not present. The social structures of whale and dolphin communities are also remarkable for their stability and complexity. Sperm whale females live in stable matrilineal groups led by older females whose knowledge of feeding grounds and migratory routes is critical to the group's survival. Orca populations live in extended family groups centered on matriarchs, with offspring remaining with their mothers for their entire lives in a degree of family cohesion that is unusual in any social animal. The grandmother effect, the evolutionary benefit of post-reproductive females who contribute to the survival of their grandchildren through knowledge and support, has been documented in orcas and is thought to be one of the reasons orca females live well past reproductive age. The complexity of whale social life also raises profound questions about the relationship between brain size and the demands of navigating a socially complex world. The large brains of cetaceans developed in a context of extended social relationships, long-distance communication, cooperative behavior, and cultural transmission across generations, exactly the same combination of pressures that many researchers believe drove the expansion of the human brain. The whale is a reminder that intelligence is not a uniquely human trait, and that the ocean, which tends to produce large, social, long-lived animals with demanding cognitive environments, is capable of producing it independently along entirely separate evolutionary lines. For most of human history, whales were understood primarily as a resource. They were large, they were numerous in many parts of the ocean, and they contained within their bodies significant quantities of oil, meat, bone, and other materials that human societies found useful. Commercial whaling began in earnest in the 17th century, when Basque, Dutch, and English whalers began hunting right whales and bowhead whales in the North Atlantic at an industrial scale. By the time the global whaling industry reached its peak in the mid-20th century, it had become one of the most destructive harvesting operations in the history of the ocean. The scale of commercial whaling is difficult to comprehend. Estimates suggest that over the course of the 20th century alone, roughly 2.9 million whales were killed globally across all species. The blue whale was hunted from an estimated pre-whaling population of perhaps 350,000 individuals to fewer than 5,000 by the time commercial hunting of blue whales was banned in 1966. The humpback whale was similarly devastated in many ocean basins. The sperm whale, the bowhead, the fin whale, the sei whale, all were reduced to fractions of their pre-whaling numbers within decades by factory ships and explosive harpoons that made hunting at scale devastatingly efficient. The ecological consequences of removing so many whales from the ocean are still being understood. Whales are not passive inhabitants of the ocean food web. They are active participants whose behavior shapes the productivity of the ecosystems they inhabit. Whale feeding in deep water and defecating near the surface, a behavior called the whale pump, moves enormous quantities of nutrients from the deep ocean to the sunlit surface waters where phytoplankton can use them. Some researchers have estimated that the pre-whaling whale population may have been responsible for recycling quantities of nutrients comparable to the input from major river systems. Reducing whale populations by 90% or more in some regions effectively switched off a significant portion of this nutrient cycling. The decision to stop commercial whaling was one of the most significant conservation achievements of the 20th century, driven in large part by a shift in how people thought about whales. The publication of research on humpback whale song in the 1970s and the subsequent release of recordings to a popular audience transformed public perception of whales from resources to be harvested to intelligent, culturally sophisticated beings deserving of protection. The International Whaling Commission moratorium on commercial whaling, which came into effect in 1986, represented a genuine turning point in the relationship between humans and the ocean's largest inhabitants. Some whale populations have recovered significantly since the moratorium. Humpback whales in many ocean basins have rebounded to levels approaching their pre-whaling numbers, a genuine conservation success. North Atlantic right whale populations remain critically low, threatened by ship strikes and entanglement in fishing gear rather than direct hunting. Blue whale populations are recovering slowly, constrained by a very slow reproductive rate, the combination of long gestation periods, single calves, and years between pregnancies that makes rebuilding a depleted population a generational undertaking. What the history of whaling also reveals is how quickly a species that took 50 million years to evolve can be pushed to the edge of extinction by industrialized hunting. The technology that made large-scale whaling possible, the steam-powered factory ship and the explosive harpoon, was developed in the late 19th century. Within roughly 70 years of those technologies being deployed at full scale, several whale species had been reduced to populations so small that their long-term viability was genuinely in question. The disproportion between the timescale of evolution and the timescale of industrial exploitation is one of the defining challenges of conservation biology. The modern ocean's whale populations face a very different set of challenges from the hunting pressure that defined the 20th century. And understanding those challenges requires understanding how profoundly the ocean has changed even in the past few decades. Climate change, ocean noise, ship strikes, entanglement in fishing gear, and the disruption of prey populations by commercial fishing are the dominant threats to whale populations today, and they interact with each other in ways that make the overall picture complex. Ocean warming is affecting the distribution and abundance of the prey species that whales depend on. Krill, the small crustaceans that form the primary food source of many baleen whale species, are highly sensitive to water temperature and ice conditions. In the Southern Ocean, where Antarctic krill support some of the largest concentrations of baleen whales on Earth, warming water temperatures and reduced sea ice are affecting krill populations in ways that are not yet fully understood but are clearly significant. Blue whales and other baleen whale species that travel enormous distances to reach the polar feeding grounds that sustain them are dependent on those grounds remaining productive. Ocean noise is a less visible but genuinely serious threat. The modern ocean is dramatically noisier than it was a century ago. Shipping traffic, sonar, seismic surveying for oil and gas, and the general industrial noise of a heavily used ocean have raised the ambient noise level in many ocean regions by orders of magnitude compared to the pre-industrial baseline. For whales, which depend on sound for communication, navigation, and in the case of toothed whales, for echolocation and hunting, this increase in background noise is a significant problem. Studies have documented humpback whales changing the frequency and amplitude of their songs in response to increased shipping noise, and beaked whales stranding themselves in response to military sonar exercises. The issue of plastic pollution in the ocean also intersects with whale biology in troubling ways. Large amounts of plastic debris have been found in the stomachs of stranded whales of multiple species. In some cases, the quantity of plastic is clearly sufficient to impair normal digestion and may contribute to mortality. Microplastics, the tiny fragments that result from the breakdown of larger plastic objects, have been found in krill and other zooplankton, which means they are entering the marine food chain at the base and moving upward through the system into the bodies of the whales that depend on krill as their primary food source. Despite these challenges, there are genuine reasons for optimism about the future of whales in the ocean. The recovery of humpback whale populations following the whaling moratorium demonstrates that whale populations can rebuild when direct hunting pressure is removed. Marine protected areas in key whale habitat, restrictions on ship speeds in whale migration corridors, modifications to fishing gear to reduce entanglement risk, and the development of quieter shipping technology are all contributing to a more hospitable ocean for whales. The science of whale biology and conservation has never been more sophisticated. What makes the whale story in the modern ocean ultimately hopeful, despite the real challenges it faces, is precisely the quality that made the whale possible in the first place: adaptability. Whales have been changing and diversifying for 50 million years in response to a constantly shifting ocean environment. The challenges they face today are severe, but they are not categorically different in kind from the environmental pressures that have shaped cetacean evolution throughout that time. The difference is the speed of the change, and the fact that the primary driver of that change is a single species making decisions that could be made differently. That distinction matters because it means the outcome is not fixed. The public will to protect whales, built partly on the cultural shift driven by the anti-whaling campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s, remains strong in most parts of the world. That will is one of the most important conservation assets the ocean currently has, and maintaining it requires telling the whale story honestly, which means telling both the story of what was nearly lost and the story of what careful, sustained conservation effort can achieve. The story of how whales returned to the sea carries with it a set of lessons that extend well beyond the biology of cetaceans. It is a story about evolutionary possibility, about the malleability of life in the face of opportunity, and about what happens when an animal commits fully to an environment that its ancestors left hundreds of millions of years earlier. Whales did not return to a simple ocean. They returned to an ocean that had been building its complexity for 500 million years, and they found a place in it that no other animal occupied in quite the same way. The first lesson is about the power of ecological opportunity. The early whale ancestors did not plan to become whales. There was no foresight involved, no direction, no goal. There was simply a coastline, a warm, shallow sea, an abundance of fish, and a small hoofed mammal that happened to be good at catching them in the water. The opportunity was there, and over millions of years, variation and selection did the rest. The same logic applies to every major evolutionary transition in the ocean's history, from the Cambrian explosion to the colonization of the land to the return of mammals to the sea. Opportunity, variation, selection, and time. The second lesson is about the completeness of evolutionary transformation. The whale is not a land mammal that learned to swim. It is an animal that has been so thoroughly remodeled by 50 million years of selection in the ocean that it can no longer function on land at all. A beached whale does not struggle back to the water and walk away. It dies because its body weight, unsupported by water, crushes its own organs. The transformation is complete, and yet the evidence of where it came from is preserved in its own body, in its flipper bones, its vestigial pelvis, its blowhole, its warm blood. Evolution does not erase the past, it builds on it. The third lesson concerns the present moment. The whale's 50 million year journey back to the sea produced animals of extraordinary biological and cultural complexity, and humanity very nearly extinguished several species of them in less than a century. The recovery of whale populations since the whaling moratorium is a genuine conservation success, but it is incomplete and fragile. The ocean is changing in ways that affect whales directly, and the decisions made in the coming decades about climate, shipping, fishing, and ocean noise will determine whether the recovery continues or stalls. Understanding that journey also means understanding something fundamental about how the modern ocean works. Whales are not simply passengers in the ocean ecosystem. They are active participants whose feeding, migrating, and dying all contribute to the nutrient cycles that support marine productivity at every level. The whale pump, the movement of nutrients from deep water to the surface through whale feeding and defecation, represents a significant ecological service. Rebuilding whale populations is not only a conservation goal, it is, in a real sense, an ocean restoration project, because an ocean with more whales in it is a more productive ocean for everything else that lives there too. The whale also offers a personal connection to deep time that is available to anyone who stands on a coastline and watches the ocean. Somewhere out there, in those same waters, animals descended from the same hoofed mammal that first waded into the Tethys 50 million years ago, are navigating by sound, raising calves, singing songs that change from year to year, and diving to depths that remain beyond the reach of any human technology. They carry within their bodies the accumulated result of one of the greatest evolutionary journeys in the history of life. They are, in the most literal sense, the ocean looking back at the land it came from. The whale returned to the ocean through one of the most remarkable evolutionary journeys in the history of life on this planet. Whether it remains in the ocean, and in what numbers, and in what health, depends on choices being made right now in this generation by a species that has the knowledge to understand what is at stake and the capacity to act on that understanding. That combination of knowledge and capacity is itself remarkable. What matters now is whether we use it. 50 million years ago, a small hoofed mammal waded into a warm, shallow sea and never fully came back out. What emerged from that coastline over millions of generations is the blue whale, the humpback, the sperm whale, the orca, the largest animals that have ever lived. Animals with cultures, with songs, with family bonds that last decades. All of them the descendants of a creature that once stood on 4 legs on dry land. In our next episode, we return to the ocean's geological history to explore the story of sea level through time, how the ocean has risen and fallen by hundreds of feet across the history of the Earth, drowning coastlines and exposing continents, and what that record tells us about the present and the future. Until then, thank you for listening.